Hi everyone, this is Mr. Zoeller, and today I'm going to bring you a screencast about African Americans in the mid-1850s. And our big essential question we're going to look at is how did African Americans face slavery and discrimination in the mid-1800s? So the first thing you need to know about African Americans in the mid-1800s is that they are treated differently depending where they live. In the northern states, African Americans are free, they are not slaves, while in the South, the vast majority of them are slaves. So let's look at the difference between them. So a slave's legal status was the same as property, like owning cattle or animals. So slaves did not have the same rights as free people, and they could be bought and sold. Rural slaves, so those that worked on farms and plantations in the South, were the vast majority of slaves. And then there were urban slaves, those that lived in the cities, and usually were hired out to factories and mills and workshops, and they were skilled laborers, and their wages were usually given to their owners. So half of all free African Americans did live in the South, and free African Americans in the South were not allowed to work in certain jobs, and most worked as laborers, craftspeople, or household servants. Free African Americans in the North held low-paying jobs, were not allowed to vote, were denied entry in public schools, and faced discrimination by whites. Despite discrimination in some formed churches, schools, and other organizations. So the big thing you need to know about African Americans is that most of them are slaves in the South. There are many still that are free, though, and the reason they don't want to leave is they have family that are still slaves, and they don't want to leave them. So next we'll look at the economics of slavery, dealing with money. So slaves were mostly owned by wealthy plantation owners in the South. Only 1 out of 4 white Southerners actually owned slaves. So then why does the South remain so loyal to slavery? So part of it has to deal with the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. So up until that point, slavery is actually on the decline in the South. And then we have in 1793, the cotton engine is invented, which was a invention that allowed slaves or anybody to work a machine to help clean out the cotton in a much quicker pace, which then allowed Southerners to grow much more cotton to make more money, because the hindrance of them expanding and growing more cotton was always how long it took to pick and clean out the cotton fibers. So in 1790, right before the invention was created, you have about 3,000 bales of cotton being produced a year, and you can see by 1850, 10 years before 1860, the election of Lincoln, we're going to have 4 million bales that are being farmed in the southern states. So supply and demand, so the price of cotton is going to increase. And so slaves are going to be more valuable to their owners. So it's going to be a very profitable crop. And so for Southerners to get rich, they need to grow more cotton, and they need more slaves to do that labor. And so we're going to have a huge rise in the demand for slaves all across the South. As the United States expands out west, we're going to have more and more farmers that are growing cotton and bringing slaves with them. And that was always a big question about adding future states of where slavery could and cannot exist. So whether they owned slaves or not, so white Southerners understood that their economy, their jobs were dependent on cotton, and they also knew that the cotton planters depended on slave labor to grow their profitable crops. So kind of answering that question about why was slavery a big deal back then. And if you take a look at this map here, you can see in the kind of the red salmon kind of color areas here, how much cotton was being grown in 1801 to 1839, and you can see where it grew and expanded over the next 20 years. And then you can also see the slave trading routes where more and more slaves are being sent where the slavery is expanding. And then down below, you can see the total population of free peoples and slaves in the North and South. So taking here at the slave states, you can kind of get a see of what proportion of the population were actually free people and which were slaves. So slaves in the South, let's look at their working conditions. So slaves worked on farms of various sizes. Some worked on small farms, some worked on huge plantations. But about 3/4 of all slaves, so 3 out of 4, were field hands, which means that they worked out and growing crops in the field. Others were seamstresses, so they would create clothing, carpenters, blacksmiths, cooks, and servants. And usually slaves started working at the age of 6 years old. They usually lived in crowded cabins, had dirt floors, and were provided just enough to stay healthy for work. They were given a clothing allowance for a year. The clothing was usually really poor quality, and when the clothing was going out and they had holes everywhere, they just had to kind of make do with what they have until they had another allowance of clothes that were given to them. So they were normally poorly clothed and housed, especially compared to white Southerners back then. But they were, not all the time, but sometimes they would receive medical attention as slave owners want their slaves to be in working order so that they can do their labor on the plantation or on the farm. So here's a photograph of a group of slaves on a plantation, so you can see it by how they're dressed here and their living conditions, the cabins that they have behind them there. Now, white Southerners, since they owned slaves, they resorted to many different ways to control their slaves, to make them do what they wanted. The main way they did that was through punishments. So they would beat their slaves, whip them. They would use hot irons and brand their slaves. And so this punishment often kept them from being able to work right away, obviously, if they have to recover from their wounds. And it did lead to greater rebellion by slaves across the South. And then you even had slave owners that would hire slave breakers, so it would be people that would come in, and their whole job was to break a slave to make sure that they would do the work they're supposed to do, that they were ordered to do. And it often involved violence, overwork, fear, and it was horrific for the slaves. And another way that they controlled slaves is making it illegal across the southern states to teach slaves to read and write. The less that the slaves knew, that they're ignorant about around the world, the more that white Southerners had control over them. So here's some examples. Here's a photograph, and you can see all the scars on the back of the slave from being whipped. And then a drawing here of a man beating a slave here and taking the child away. And that happened often. All right, resistance to slavery. So slaves did not just take everything that came to them. They did resist against it as well. So there was some day-to-day resistance. So the ways they did that was just by quietly doing things, so pulling down fences, breaking tools, damaging crops, sneaking food out, just little things that they could do without getting caught. Pretending to be sick, going crazy, insane, blind, just to resist from not doing work. And then sometimes they would try to poison their slave owners, start fires, destroy property. So those are some kind of day-to-day resistance things that slaves performed. You also had open defiance, where they would refuse to work, reject orders, and that would often lead to violence. Another way that slaves resisted was to run away, which was very risky and dangerous. And so the risk was, of course, slave catchers would be sent after you. They would use usually hunting dogs that would find your scent based off of your clothing or that you had back where you're from. And then if you were captured, you were severely beaten and whipped. So if you were going to run away, you usually would need to travel by night, hide out by the day, and then you would try to use boats, trains, and try to get a false ID, a fake ID if you could. And there are some instances of slaves being mailed in boxes and coffins as a way of getting out of where they're at. Later on, we're going to have a network of people, a secret organization called the Underground Railroad, and their task is to free as many slaves as they can from slavery in the South and get them to freedom, to free states, or free countries like Mexico and Canada. So the members would provide transportation and safe houses, and different people had different jobs. So for instance, conductors were the people that would go down into the southern states, find the slaves, lead them to a safe place, a station. And the most famous conductor is Harriet Tubman. And if you want to know more about the Underground Railroad, I highly recommend watching the film Harriet about that. Another way of resistance is slave rebellions, when all-out rebellion by slaves. So we have a couple examples here. We have the Denmark-Vesey rebellion in 1822 in Charleston, South Carolina, where authorities learned of a plan to lead revolt. We're not sure how accurate that is. And Vesey and 30 other slaves were arrested and hanged. And then in 1831 in Virginia, we have the Nat Turner Rebellion, where Turner and his followers were armed with axes and guns, and they set to kill every white person that they could find. And over the next 2 days, they ended up killing 57 people in their trying to stop this slavery in the area that they were at. In regards to slave families and communities, so since slaves were considered property, there was issues with the legality of their marriages. So slave marriages were not recognized. Therefore, slave families did not exist, and slave owners could sell husbands and wives, children, siblings from each other from one place to another. So slaves would usually create their own weddings, and they had the tradition of jumping over the broomstick. Of course, control of children rested with the master. So some lessons that children were taught early on is to be silent around white people, to be obedient, and to respect themselves and members of the slave community. And once again, remember, they started working at the age of around 6 or 7. And then when slaves did have leisure time to rest, which wasn't that often, usually 1 day a week, usually on Sundays, they'd have quilting bees where they would get together and knit and quilt together. just to for clothing or bedding that they need for their family. It's time for them to talk while they're doing that. You have a quilting feast and dancing that they would do after sewing was done, and they would sing and play with their instruments. And then, of course, on Sunday they would have religion, their church, recreation, different things that they would have. But once again, most of the time they were working every single day. And then when it comes to faith and religion, this was really important to slaves in the United States. And there were basically two churches. You have the kind of the slaveholders' church, which was slaves were forced to attend to. Masters would read from the Bible to the workers, or they would have preachers come and read to them. And they always would focus on verses focusing on the slave master being obedient to the earthly masters, and then they would be rewarded in heaven with that. Never did they read other passages about, the masters to love their bondservants, their slaves, as Jesus loved the church. I'm sure they skipped that part. And then you have the secret churches, the invisible ones that the slaves would have for themselves, where they would meet in slave quarters. They would recount and stories of Moses freeing the Egyptian slaves out of Egypt, and that's symbolizing their trying to get to the promised land of the free states in the Union. And then they sang spiritual songs expressing their desire for freedom during those services, but also while they were working. And then African American culture, so we have these songs and spirituals that were created that just helped the slaves to just to kind of keep their morale going. And some of the traditions and singing and dancing were things that they brought from Africa with them, that they kind of wove in with American music and art that they did. All right, everybody, that concludes this screencast on African Americans in the mid-1800s. I hope you learned something. Have a great day. Bye-bye.